His mother left him, so he raised his little sister like a father. In the end, she paid him back. Their mother abandoned them, leaving a void in their lives, and in that empty space, young Ethan found himself stepping up to be the father his little sister Grace desperately needed. But what Grace did next would be something no one could have foreseen. Ethan and Grace were two children whose lives were steeped in loneliness and shadow. They grew up in a house devoid of warmth, where the light barely grazed their faces and happiness was but a distant dream, always hovering at the edges of their world but never crossing their threshold. Joy in their home was like a rare visitor, appearing only briefly before retreating, leaving behind a hollow silence. For them, happiness felt like a treasure they were never meant to hold. Despite her tender years, Grace became Ethan's steadfast protector, the one source of comfort in a world that seemed intent on crushing their spirits. She would pull her younger brother close, holding him with an intensity that belied her small frame. "Be strong, Ethan," she whispered, determination lacing her voice as she stroked his hair, attempting to shield him from their bleak reality. "One day, everything will be different. I promise. We'll find happiness." Yet, even as she said these words, Grace felt an ache in her heart, aware that each passing day only seemed to bring more hardship and despair. Ethan, though barely a child himself, bore a weight no one his age should have to carry. Their mother, a woman obsessed with appearances and blinded by her ambition, had long decided that her children were mere inconveniences to be hidden away from the world. Ethan, in particular, was a burden she wanted erased from her perfectly curated public life. "I can't let people know I have another child," she muttered bitterly one day, her voice cold and detached as she looked down at him. She never saw the confusion or pain in his eyes. To her, he was an unwanted complication, and with a chilling lack of emotion, she made her decision. "You're nothing but a burden, Ethan. You'll stay in the attic where no one will see you, where no one will even know you exist." Ethan's small voice trembled as he looked up at her, trying to understand the disdain in her gaze. "What did I do wrong, Mom?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, clinging to a thin hope that her heart might soften, that she might change her mind. But the only response he received was the sharp, final click of a lock, sealing him in the attic's darkness. Days in that attic stretched into an eternity. The wooden walls felt as though they were closing in on him, a suffocating prison that held him captive. Tiny cracks in the ceiling allowed only the faintest slivers of light to seep through, and even those fractured beams reminded him of a freedom he could only imagine. Each night, he listened to the sounds of the house below, wondering if his sister was safe, hoping she hadn't forgotten him, even as the cruel reality of his isolation tried to steal away his hope. Time passed in suffocating silence, each minute blending into the next as Ethan listened to the faint sounds of life in the house below. Every creak, every whisper of movement became a lifeline, a sliver of connection to the world he was banished from. He'd wait, heart pounding for the sound of familiar footsteps. When they finally came, his heart raced with a bittersweet mix of hope and dread. Grace, his sister, was the only soul who dared to visit him, her quiet resilience guiding her as she climbed the stairs with cautious, measured steps, carrying a small plate of food in her trembling hands. "Ethan, here, take this," she whispered, her voice low, wary of the ever-looming threat of being discovered. "Eat quickly before Mom finds out." She would sit beside him, and as he ate, her soft words wrapped around him like a fragile bridge built of whispered promises and shared dreams, an escape plan spoken only in the quiet of the attic. "I can't stand seeing you like this," she admitted, her voice choked with suppressed sobs as her eyes shimmered with tears. "I promise I'll get you out of here, no matter what it takes." Yet as the days passed, Grace's promise began to feel as delicate and fleeting as the thin air in that cramped attic space. Her words, once bright with hope, seemed to drift away, dissolving into the cold silence that surrounded them. One day, as Ethan's hope started to dim, he turned to her, a question that had gnawed at him, escaping in a voice laced with both innocence and sorrow. "Grace, do you think anyone will notice I'm gone?" His voice was soft, almost as if he feared the answer. Grace looked at him, her face shadowed by her own unspoken fears. She forced a smile, but her eyes betrayed her, glistening with a sadness that she could barely. But fate, capricious as ever, seemed to have other plans for the two siblings whose hearts clung to a fragile hope that stubbornly refused to die. Confined in the attic, Ethan's world was a dark, lonely prison. His only companions, the distant echoes of laughter and revelry drifting up from below. The lively voices of his mother's guests punctuated the silence, Each cheer and laugh a cruel reminder that while they feasted and celebrated, he remained hidden and forgotten in the shadows as if he were invisible. Grace, he whispered softly, envisioning his sister moving through the house below, swept into the noise and demands of the guests, a silent servant fulfilling their mother's relentless commands. Ethan could picture it clearly. Each time someone called for her, Grace's small, tired frame would spring into action, never hesitating, never refusing, as if defiance had been drained from her. Be strong, Grace, he thought, willing his quiet strength to her, hoping she could feel it, even from his dark confinement. But the nights were the hardest. As laughter and clinking glasses filled the rooms below, Ethan curled up alone in a corner of the attic, wrapping his arms around his knees, his silent sorrow pressing heavier with each passing day. Every sunset seemed to steal a bit more of his hope, each dusk casting his world in a deeper darkness, an unrelenting weight pressing down on his spirit, nearly suffocating him. Then, one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a sound broke through the monotony of celebration, a piercing scream that echoed through the house, sharp and raw with terror. It was Grace's voice, filled with desperation and fear. "No! Please, don't touch me!" Her words struck Ethan like a bolt of lightning, igniting an overwhelming need to protect her. "Grace!" he shouted, his voice choked with panic, throwing himself against the attic door in a desperate attempt to reach her. All sense of confinement vanished in that moment, overtaken by a primal urge to break free, to shield her from whatever danger she faced. Each furious pound of his fists against the door was both a plea for help and a fierce declaration of his determination. "Grace, I'm here, I'm coming!" Ethan hammered against the door, his fists red and aching, until finally, with a shattering crash, the lock gave way. He didn't stop to consider his next step. Instinct alone drove him. He flew down the stairs, feet barely skimming the steps as he followed the sound of his sister's terrified cries. Each beat of his heart was a drum of urgency, pushing him faster, drawing him closer. In that moment, nothing else mattered. All that existed was his sister's voice and his need to reach her, to shield her from the darkness they had both endured for far too long. When Ethan reached the living room, he froze, his heart pounding as he took in the sight before him. One of the men, a familiar face among their mother's frequent guests, a man who came to gorge on food and wine, indifferent to the world around him, was standing over Grace, who was curled up in the corner, her small frame trembling as she sobbed. "Get away from her!" Ethan roared, his voice echoing with a fury he had never felt before. The man spun around, startled by the boy's sudden presence. He sneered, clearly amused. "And who are you?" he mocked, unaware of the fierce resolve igniting within Ethan. "I'm her brother," Ethan replied, his voice steady, unwavering, "and I won't let you hurt her." Without a second's hesitation, he threw himself at the man, channeling every ounce of strength he had. The man stumbled, shocked and off balance, before crashing to the floor in a heap. Ethan stood there gasping for breath, positioning himself protectively between the man and his sister, his eyes blazing with an intensity that left no room for doubt. Grace looked up at him, her tear-streaked face a mixture of shock and gratitude. "Ethan, how did you—" "We have to go, Grace," he interrupted, his tone fierce and resolute as he reached out, gripping her hand tightly. "We can't stay here another second." Grace looked into her brother's eyes, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something she had only dreamed of, a glimmer of freedom. She nodded, understanding completely. Together, they rose to their feet and bolted toward the front door, their hands clasped tightly, neither daring to look back. Their mother's furious shouts echoed behind them, her voice a twisted mixture of rage and shock, but her words faded into the night as the siblings burst out of the house. The cold night air bit at their faces as they ran, but they felt only a rush of fear mixed with newfound liberation. "Never again, Grace," Ethan declared, his voice steady as he held her hand even tighter. "Never again." "Yes, Ethan," Grace replied, her voice filled with a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. "We'll never go back." And so, under the faint glow of the stars, the two siblings ran into the unknown, bound by a shared promise. They had left behind the shadows of a home that had never known love. And as they stepped into the future, they knew that as long as they stayed together, no one and nothing could tear them apart. Yet, the freedom they had longed for came with its own harsh reality. The streets, far from the sanctuary they had imagined, quickly revealed themselves to be a constant struggle. Each day was a battle, a relentless search for scraps of food, for a sheltered corner where they could rest without the bitter night air cutting into their skin. They found only fleeting moments of peace amid the ceaseless noise and chaos of the city. Hunger gnawed at them, an ever-present reminder of their vulnerability, while fear became a familiar companion, tightening in their stomachs and clouding their minds. But even in those dark moments, Ethan and Grace clung to one another, their bond forged through shared pain and unwavering loyalty. Together, they faced each grueling day, knowing that even in the most uncertain and harsh places, they had each other, and that was a light no one could extinguish. Ethan held tightly to his sister's hand, feeling that it was the only thing binding them to each other, the single thread keeping them moving forward. "Grace, we can't give up," he urged, forcing a tone of confidence he wasn't sure he felt. The weight of despair was pressing down on him too, but he knew he had to be strong for her. "We've got to find a way out of this." But Grace, weary and worn, seemed to be reaching the end of her strength. Tears brimmed in her eyes, her exhaustion finally overwhelming her. "Ethan, I'm so tired," she whispered one day, her legs shaking as she stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Her voice was barely audible, choked with fatigue and fear. "I'm hungry and I'm scared. I don't want to do this anymore." Ethan looked at her, his heart breaking at the sight of her suffering, seeing the pain that mirrored his own. He had tried to be her protector, but now, watching her struggle, he felt an ache of guilt for leading them down this path. "I know, Grace, I know," he murmured, his voice thick with sorrow and self-doubt. Maybe we should go back." Grace's gaze lifted, filled with hesitation and disbelief. "Do you think she'd let us come back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as though the thought itself was too fragile, too dangerous to voice out loud. Her question hung in the air, a desperate hope that felt almost impossible to grasp. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, pressing his lips together tightly. "But we have to try. We can't keep living like this." He could see the flicker of fragile hope in her eyes as she listened, and with reluctant resolve, the siblings began the long walk back to the house they had once sworn never to return to. Each step in that direction felt like a thorn digging deeper into their souls, each footfall a reminder of the pain and rejection they risked facing once more. When they finally arrived, they stood frozen in front of the door, their hearts pounding as the reality of their decision settled over them. Grace's hand trembled in his, her face pale as she looked up at him. "Ethan, what if she doesn't want us?" she asked, her voice shaking, not just from the chill of the night, but from the fear that they might be turned away once again, left to face the world alone. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to stand tall, trying to be brave for them both. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, her voice as sharp as a knife. "I thought you weren't coming back." Ethan took a shaky breath, but his gaze held steady. "Mom, we have nowhere else to go," he began, his voice laced with quiet determination. "We thought maybe you'd let us stay. We won't cause any trouble, I promise." Grace, her eyes brimming with tears, stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, Mom, we just need somewhere safe. We won't ask for anything else." But instead of softening, their mother's expression hardened. She let out a bitter laugh, dripping with scorn. "Ha! Come back after what you did, after the way you embarrassed me?" "No," sneered, each word cutting deeper. "My new boyfriend and my friends don't want to hear about you two. You're not welcome." "Please, Mom," Grace begged, her voice breaking, but their mother silenced her with a harsh wave of her hand. "No, I told you I don't want anything to do with you. I never want to see your face. This isn't your home. It never was, and it never will be. Now get out before I change my—" That, she slammed the door, sound echoing like a hammer blow against their heart. Grace crumbled, her soft sobs filling the empty night as Ethan stood, his own heart twisted with a mixture of anger and sorrow so intense it felt like it would split him in two. They stood in silence, their shattered hopes lying at their feet, while the cold night air wrapped around them like a chilling reminder of their isolation. Ethan blinked back tears that threatened to fall, his heart aching, but he tightened his grip on Grace's hand, holding on to her as if she was the last solid thing in his world. "Come on, Grace," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging within him. "We don't need anyone. If they don't want us, fine. We've got each other, and that's enough." Grace wiped her tears with the sleeve of her worn-out sweater, a new fire igniting in her gaze. "You're right, Ethan. We don't need anyone else. It's just us, and that's all we need." With a final look at the house that had never been their home, the two siblings turned their backs on it, leaving behind the emptiness and cruelty that had defined their past. As they walked away, the road ahead felt daunting and uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet foresee, but there was a strength in their steps, a quiet resolve that grew with each stride. They had lost everything except the love and resilience that bound them together. And with that bond, they stepped forward into the unknown, carrying with them the promise of a better life. Never again would they search for love in a place where it didn't exist. Ethan's heart raced with newfound courage, his mind clear and his purpose sharper than ever before. The future was theirs to shape, and as long as they had each other, he knew they could face whatever lay ahead. Ethan gripped Grace's hand tightly, his gaze steady as he looked into her fearful eyes. "Grace, we have to leave," he urged, his voice firm but laced with a desperation he couldn't hide. "This place is killing us. There's nothing here for us." Grace's small hand trembled in his, her expression filled with uncertainty. "But where will we go, Ethan?" she whispered, her voice cracking with each word. "We have nowhere to go." Ethan took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the heavy weight of responsibility settle on his young shoulder. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice soft but resolute. "But I do know we can't stay here. Mom doesn't want us, and no one else here will either. We'll find our own way, a place where we can finally be happy." His words were bold, a beacon of hope for his sister. But inside, fear curled within him, a shadow he couldn't quite shake. Hand in hand, the two siblings took their first steps away from the house that had never truly been their home. The night enveloped them in a quiet, cold embrace, and the stars overhead seemed to watch as silent witnesses to their painful departure. Their steps were light but determined, a mixture of fear and fragile hope echoing with each footfall as they wandered aimlessly through the darkened street. There was no looking back. The past was steeped in pain, and they yearned for something better, a future untouched by the shadows that had haunted them. They walked for hours, their footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness of the empty street. Occasionally, the wind rustled through the trees, whispering a reminder of their solitude. Eventually, their weary feet carried them to a nearby park, where dim streetlights flickered, casting long, thin shadows across the ground. "We can stay here, Grace," Ethan suggested, pointing to a bench beneath a large, sheltering oak tree. "It's not much, but at least we're together." He tried to offer her a reassuring smile, though he knew there was little to smile about. Grace's eyes, heavy with exhaustion and fear, reflected her hesitation, but she nodded, too tired to protest. They sat down on the bench, and Ethan did his best to make her comfortable, wrapping her in his frayed sweater as a makeshift blanket. "Close your eyes and try to rest," he whispered, stroking her hair gently. "We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." Grace curled up beside him, her body tense with fear that refused to let her drift into sleep. "Ethan, I'm scared," she admitted. Ethan rummaged through trash cans, searching for scraps that might still be edible. A stale piece of bread or a bruised piece of fruit became a rare treasure, a small meal to tide them over. Grace joined him, though her small hands trembled with cold and exhaustion as she picked through the discarded food. "Look, I found this," Ethan announced one day, his voice filled with a rare hint of excitement as he held up a half-eaten apple. "Thank you, Ethan," Grace murmured, nibbling on a small piece he offered. "You always take such good care of me." Every so often, a kind stranger would notice them and offer a bit of food or an old blanket, a small gesture that provided a brief comfort in their difficult lives. But most days, they were on their own, relying on each other to survive. Their bond was their anchor, the only constant in a world that seemed intent on pushing them to the margin. One afternoon, an elderly man stopped beside them, extending a small bag of snacks toward Ethan. "Here, son," he said with a kind smile. "Take this and keep an eye on your sister. She's lucky to have you, and you're lucky to have her." The simple words struck Ethan deeply, offering him a much-needed moment of strength. But the world wasn't always kind. They encountered plenty of harsh glances, eyes filled with fear, judgment, and pity. Many passersby would turn away, quickening their pace, as if the sight of the two children were something shameful or something they could catch. "Why do they look at us like that, Ethan?" Grace asked quietly one day, sadness clouding her gaze. "Did we do something wrong?" Ethan's heart tightened as he watched her, anger and helplessness twisting inside him. "No, Grace," he reassured her, though frustration lingered in his voice. "People don't understand. They don't know us or what we've been through." Grace nodded, but the sadness lingered, her young face bearing a weariness far beyond her years. As each day gave way to night, the park transformed into a world of shadows under the streetlights, and Ethan did his best to make their little corner by the oak tree as comfortable as he could. "Rest, Grace," he would whisper, draping what remained of his worn jacket around her shoulder. "Tomorrow will be better. I promise." And with that, they settled in, braving the cold and their hunger, facing each night together. Despite the hardships, the bitter chill, and the gnawing emptiness of hunger, they found strength in each other. Their lives were harder than any child should have to endure, yet they clung to the hope that one day, somewhere, they would find a place where kindness and happiness weren't strangers. As time slipped by, small changes began to emerge, subtle shifts that promised the start of something new. It was at the work site that Grace met Tyler, a young laborer with a warm smile and eyes that held a kindness rarely seen in their world. "Hey, Grace," he would call out whenever she arrived, his voice filled with easy charm. Always so punctual, always so sweet, Grace, unaccustomed to receiving such attention, felt her heart flutter whenever he looked her way, his gaze lingering just a moment longer than anyone else's ever had. Ethan quickly noticed the change in her. Her face lit up differently whenever Tyler was nearby, quiet happiness stirring in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "Be careful, Grace," he cautioned one day, watching her linger at the site long after her shift ended. "You know how those guys can be. I don't want you getting hurt." Grace only laughed, brushing off his concern with a lighthearted smile. "Don't worry, Ethan," she replied, her tone reassuring. "Tyler's not like the others. He actually understands me. He listens, and he makes me feel special." Ethan didn't say more, but his protective instinct lingered, watching as her connection with Tyler grew deeper. As the days passed, Grace's feelings for Tyler blossomed. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of a life beyond survival, a life filled with someone who seemed to genuinely care. She began to dream of leaving the daily struggles behind, imagining a future with someone who wanted to build something real with her. For a girl who had known little affection, the possibility was like a beacon. Then, one evening, after a long, tiring day, Ethan returned to the park bench where they always met, only to find it empty. Panic tightened in his chest. "Grace!" he called out, his voice raw with worry as he searched the empty spaces around him. There was no answer, but then he noticed a note folded neatly on the bench, the writing shaky but determined. "Ethan, I've gone with Tyler. He loves me and wants to take care of me. I can't keep living like this. Thank you for everything you've done, but I need to find my own happiness. Don't worry, I'll be okay. Love, Grace." The words felt like a blow, stealing his breath. Ethan sank onto the bench, the weight of her absence settling over him, cold and unyielding. His sister, his only family, the person he had fought to protect through every hardship, had left him behind. "Grace," he whispered, his voice choked with disbelief and sorrow, his world unraveling as he read the note again and again. The park, once their place of safety, felt hollow and empty without her. "I promised I'd take care of you, Grace," he murmured, grief tightening his chest. Now I'm alone." Tears rolled down his face as he sat there, lost in a loneliness deeper than he'd ever known. Yet, amid the pain, something within him began to solidify. As his sorrow weighed heavy, a fierce resolve rose in its place. He couldn't give up. Not now. He would carry on, for her, for the future they had once dreamed of together. And with his heart fractured but his will stronger than ever, he stood, ready to face whatever came next, alone but unbroken. Ethan stood up, clutching Grace's note tightly, a small but unbreakable resolve hardening within him. He would keep moving forward no matter how painful or lonely the road ahead felt. He would fight for her, for himself, and for the future he was determined to build, even if it felt like he was doing it alone. Yet despite Grace's absence, she was never far from his mind. Each day at the construction site, his thoughts drifted back to her, haunted by a single persistent question: is she okay? He had no way of knowing where she was or what her life had become, but a gnawing feeling in his gut told him something was wrong. On the toughest days, after hours of grueling work, he would find himself wandering the city streets, scanning the faces of strangers, hoping and praying to catch a glimpse of her. Please let her be safe," he murmured quietly each time. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched into months, there was still no trace of Grace. And with each passing day, his worry grew deeper. Then, one afternoon, while taking a short break, Ethan overheard a few of the workers speaking in low, cautious voices. "Did you hear about that girl Tyler's been keeping around?" one man asked, his tone dark with concern. "I heard he treats her real bad," another added, shaking his head sadly. "Apparently, he won't even let her leave the house, and he hits her when he's been drinking." Ethan's heart stopped, the words like ice cutting into him. It felt as if the ground had dropped from beneath his feet. Grace. His mind raced, his breath catching in his throat. No, it can't be. But deep down, he knew. The dread that had haunted him since she left now crystallized into a horrifying certainty. Without a second thought, Ethan dropped everything and ran, a fierce urgency propelling him forward. He didn't know where Tyler lived, but he pushed himself toward the roughest parts of the city, following instinct alone. He asked strangers on the streets, pleaded with anyone who might know, describing Grace with as much detail as he could muster. Finally, a kind neighbor directed him toward a crumbling, dilapidated house at the end of a narrow alley. "The girl you're looking for lives there," the man said, a note of caution in his voice. "But be careful. The man she's with, he's bad news." Ethan thanked him and walked toward the house. his heart thundering in his chest. As he reached the door, he heard shouting from inside and his stomach twisted. Gritting his teeth, he took a breath, gathering his courage, and prepared himself for what he might find. "Grace!" Ethan shouted, hurling himself against the door until it gave way and crashed open. The sight before him was heart-wrenching. Grace lay crumpled on the floor, her face streaked with tears, bruises marking her skin. Towering over her was Tyler, his face twisted with rage. "Who the hell are you?" Tyler bellowed as Ethan stepped inside, his anger barely contained. "I'm her brother," Ethan replied fiercely, his voice steady with the strength born of desperation. "And I'm here to take her away from you." Without hesitation, he lunged at Tyler, slamming him against the wall with all the power he could muster. "You'll never touch her again," he shouted, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and urgency. But before he could do anything more, Grace struggled to her feet, her expression a mixture of pain and confusion. "No, Ethan!" she cried, her voice raw with anger and fear. "Stay out of my life. I don't want you here. I hate you. I never want to see you again." Ethan froze, her words like a punch to his gut. "Grace, I'm only trying to help," he pleaded, his voice breaking under the weight of her rejection. But she cut him off, her tear-filled eyes flashing with anger. "Leave!" she screamed, pointing to the door. "Just leave me alone. I don't need your help." In that moment, Ethan's heart shattered. He had come to save her, to pull her from this darkness, but he realized that he couldn't force her to leave. He couldn't make her want freedom. Swallowing his grief, he took a step back, casting one last look of sorrow at his sister before he turned and walked out of the house, leaving her behind. As the door slammed shut, it felt like a final blow to his soul, sealing off a piece of his life that would always haunt him. Years went by, but the pain of that moment remained, a constant ache that he carried with him. Yet, despite the hurt, Ethan refused to let it consume him. Determined to build something out of the ashes, he poured himself into his work, determined to change the trajectory of his life. Through unwavering dedication, he achieved a goal he'd once thought impossible. He was accepted into college. "I'm going to change my fate," he vowed. He chose to study architecture, channeling every ounce of his pain, hope, and ambition into his designs. Every line and sketch held the emotions he couldn't otherwise express. He graduated with honors, his talent and passion drawing the attention of those around him. Soon, his work became widely known, each project an expression of resilience and soul. The buildings he designed weren't just functional. They breathed with life, mirroring his journey and his transformation. In time, Ethan became one of the city's most celebrated architects, admired by all, from everyday citizens to seasoned critics. His name became synonymous with vision and perseverance, his work a testament to the power of rising from pain to create beauty. Ethan's name became synonymous with excellence and beauty, and with his success came immense wealth and recognition. Yet, despite the acclaim and fortune, he never saw Grace again. Every night as he closed his eyes, he would see her as the little girl he had once tried so hard to protect. Though the world celebrated his achievements, a part of him remained incomplete, a part only Grace could fill. Despite his fame, the beautiful structures he'd crafted, and the fortune he'd amassed, Grace was never far from his thoughts. Each day, his mind drifted back to her, to the sister he had sworn to protect, but had lost in a single, desperate moment. "Where are you, Grace?" he would murmur to himself, standing by the large window of his sleek, modern office, gazing out over the city. He hired investigators, retraced their old routes, spoke with anyone who might have crossed paths with her, but each effort ended in disappointment. No matter how high his success climbed, the ache of Grace's absence never dulled. With each new milestone, a hollow sense of longing grew in him, a reminder that some things were beyond his reach. The homes he designed, filled with warmth, love, and hope, only reminded him of the life he'd once dreamed of having with his sister. The unanswered questions haunted him. Sometimes the despair felt overwhelming, but he refused to give up. He held on to a thread of hope that one day he would find her. And then, on a day like any other, the unimaginable. Ethan was in his office, intently reviewing blueprints for a new project, when he heard a soft knock at the door. Surprised, as he wasn't expecting visitors, he set the papers down and walked over. As he opened the door, his heart stopped. Standing on the threshold was Grace. Her frame was thin, her face marked by years of hardship, her eyes filled with tears. Beside her, two young children clung to her skirt, their eyes wide with both fear and wonder. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely holding itself together. Ethan felt as though the world had stopped. His sister, His beloved Grace was here, standing in front of him after all these years. "Grace," he exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion and disbelief. I can't believe it. Where have you been? What happened to you?" Grace looked down, her tears falling freely as she struggled to speak. She glanced at her children, then back at him, and in that moment, words were unnecessary. Ethan understood that her journey had been as hard as his fears had always imagined, but she was here. And so, as they stood there, both overwhelmed by years of pain and relief, the reunion they had both longed for began, a chance for healing that neither had thought possible. "My life has been a nightmare, Ethan," Grace began, her voice barely holding together. "I left with Tyler thinking I'd find something better, but it only got worse. He abused me, denied me food, denied me love." Her voice cracked as she paused, the weight of her words bearing down on her. "I was wrong, Ethan. I left you, and I paid the highest price. But seeing what you've accomplished, it both breaks my heart and fills me with hope." Grace's composure crumbled, and she collapsed into tears, her sobs muffled against Ethan's shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly. "Grace, you've always been my sister," he said softly. "No matter what's happened, you'll always have a place here. You and your children, you're my family. Welcome home." She clung to him, weeping with a mix of relief and regret. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered through. "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I'd lost my..." In the days that followed, both their lives began to fill with new light. Grace and her children found the home they'd always longed for under Ethan's roof. The laughter of her children echoed through the halls, slowly dissolving the shadows that had once haunted their lives. The sense of family and hope, something Ethan hadn't felt in years, began to breathe life back into the home. But this newfound peace was shattered one afternoon by an unexpected knock at the door. When Ethan opened it, he was met with a face from his past, their mother, aged by time and marred by desperation. "Ethan, Grace, please forgive me," she pleaded, her voice thin and strained. "I need your help, just a little money." Grace stepped forward, her expression steely in a way Ethan had never seen. "Money? Forgiveness?" she scoffed, her voice laced with bitterness. "You made me live through the worst years of my life. I don't need your forgiveness, and I never did. You won't get anything from us because you deserve nothing." Her words, harsh but honest, struck their mother like a blow, their mother's face twisted with anger. "If you don't help me, I'll tell Tyler where you are," she threatened, her voice cold and sharp. "I'll tell him to come." Ethan stepped forward, his expression a mix of sadness and anger. "Do tell him where we are. I'm not afraid of him or you, but this is the last time you'll ever come. Leave now." Stunned, their mother hesitated for a moment before turning and walking away, her threats and pleas falling flat resolve. As she left, Ethan and Grace closed the door, knowing they had finally shut out the darkness that had once controlled their lives. Together, they faced the future, free of the past grip, ready to embrace the family they had rebuilt from hope, love, and strength. Ethan's response was cold and resolute. His mother, realizing she was out of options, stormed away, casting one last look of pure contempt over her shoulder. But true to her threat, Tyler soon appeared at their doorstep, his face twisted with rage. This time, though, Ethan was ready. With a single nod, he signaled his guard. "Take him." The guard surrounded Tyler, restraining him as he cursed and struggled. "Ethan, curse you! Why didn't you tell me you were rich? Why didn't you tell me you had power?" he shouted, his voice thick with fury. Screams faded, dragged away, bound for jail. Meanwhile, their mother, humiliated and defeated, was escorted off the property. "Don't ever come back," Ethan warned. "We found peace and we won't let you steal it from us again." And so, the storm that had shadowed their lives finally passed. Grace and her children embraced the home and safety they had dreamed of. Together, as it always should have been, they built a life filled with laughter and warmth. The past, once a haunting shadow, gave way to light and joy. Each day was a gift, each moment a celebration of the freedom they had earned. At last, they had found the place where they belonged, where peace and happiness were no longer distant dreams, but a beautiful reality. What a journey, right? And while this story may be fictional, it reflects a truth that's all too real. Ethan and Grace were fortunate in the end. They found a way out of their nightmare. But in reality, not every child is so lucky. Countless children suffer in silence without the love and support they need. For many, the scars of neglect and emotional pain can last a lifetime. As parents, guardians, and members of society, it's essential to ask ourselves, are we creating a safe, loving environment for the children around us? Are we giving them the security they need or letting them slip through the cracks like Ethan nearly did? This story leaves us with an important lesson. Neglect and cruelty can have far-reaching consequences, and it's up to all of us to break that cycle. What did you take away from this story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going because together, we can build a better future for all children. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more meaningful content like this. Let's make a difference, one story at a time.